رح نبدأ مع الدكتور يزيد عناني. دكتور يزيد هو رئيس البرنامج العام في مؤسسة عبد المحسن القطان. عمل سابقاً عضو هيئة أكاديمية في دائرة الهندسة المعمارية وبرنامج الماجستير في التخطيط الحضري في جامعة بيرزيت، كما ترأس المجلس الأكاديمي لأكاديمية الفنون الدولية في فلسطين بين 2010 و 2012، وهو عضو في عدة مجموعات فنية منها متلازمة رام الله ودار. عنوان المداخلة اللي راح يشاركنا فيها اليوم: الحرية والديمقراطية وإعادة تشكيل مدننا. تفضل يزيد.
شكرا مها.
Today we will talk about liberty, democracy and the restructuring of our cities. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mudan, for the Muwatin conference, and I am very pleased to talk about my work and to link it. Mudan always challenges me to link my work with honor and democracy. I will try to link things between my work and other things, such as also democracy and public spaces. In reality, my work started by my, I don't know why the photo is not coming up here. I'm sorry. Let me just get the technical thing down. I'm sorry. Yes, so I was looking in the archives of Ramallah municipality, and we were working on a project with the municipality of Ramallah, and I noticed that in '94 there was an article of Nasib Shaheen. He came from the US to Ramallah, and he saw that Ramallah is being built and changed, big high-rise buildings, so he chose to go to the municipality and meet the Ramallah mayor, and he told them, hey, what's happening with Ramallah? This is not the Ramallah that I know. This is all business towers that are being erected, big residential houses and buildings. And so Nasib Shaheen gets upset and starts really having an argument with the mayor, and some of the mayor's assistants told him, hey, your old Ramallah is not the current Ramallah, it's a different Ramallah, okay? So Nasib Shaheen writes a book called, actually in a journal called This is Ramallah. And so in this issue, journal is issued in the States, and he talks about or writes down about Ramallah. So when I came back from my PhD in 2007, there were several groups which were trying to negotiate with the municipality about the development of the city. And I remember that the Nuzha Street, which is Nuzha Street, yes, in Ramallah, it is well-known. Everyone knows it. So there was a piece of land next to the library in Nuzha Street, and there was supposed to be a business tower there, but lots of problems came up. Many people disagreed with that, and there was a meeting with Majid Hadid, and I remember I talked with him about this, and we held a meeting inside the municipality, and we did the negotiations with the municipality, and the municipality said this will be delayed. And after several years, when we traveled abroad, we came back and saw that the municipality actually started working on doing that, even though they said, yeah, okay, you want to talk with us, be part of our committees, and fine, said the municipality, but it's as if they manipulated the situation. They listen to what you say, but then for nothing, they do what they want to. And this is what I'm trying to say. There's always lots of major changes taking place inside the city, and it seems like democracy in the production of the city does not exist. Look at Babylon. This other other city, how it was developed. So the controlling powers tried to intervene, whether politically or economically. So most of the things that are taking, most of the lectures talk about the organizational aspects, but I am talking from the practical engineering points of view. Of course, the legal and organization are one thing, and the actual application is another thing. I will talk about the application points of view and the visual aspects, which are among my specializations. Now, this also brings us to the philosophers who talked about Paris. Jean Haussmann talked about this. Paris was like the model for the modern city, and Eugene talked about the relation between individuals and the state. And so when Haussmann built New York, he took into consideration how an army could come and enter people inside of Paris in order to curb demonstrations. So whether it's Paris or New York, both of them were designed in a certain way to take into consideration various things, including the train in the Paris area and how boulevards are to be established in order to accommodate the military forces that are going to curb demonstrations, how the cities will be divided to various regions and areas in which you can face riots, to have different blocks inside the cities. And then, of course, a large number of European cities were designed based on several debates took place on what is the best model for a city and what is the best urban environment that can help the culture of the person and how we can control the person through that urban thing. Many people talked about that thing. We can talk about Maidan al-Tahrir, Tahrir Square, before Egypt events, before Sisi and after Sisi. After Sisi, there was the elimination of the metro, and he put some barracks. So there's always some control taking place. People who want to post control, they change the cities, urban features in order to control. What I want to focus on are the changes that are taking place in our cities, especially in the Middle East cities, specifically in Ramallah. We know that especially after 9/11, what happened was that a large number of Gulf investments and oil related investments were stopped in many countries. Hence, some people chose to redirect the investments on certain cities in the Middle East. We know that some cities like Beirut, there's lots of investments, Abdali in Jordan, Irsal Center and Rawabi in Palestine. All of these were established in the same period. These were in about 2005. 2005 was an important year for development in our Arab region, specifically Dream City in Cairo, Pearl in Rabat, and Pearl Island in Doha, Qatar. and even the Jabal Umar project in Mecca, Mountain Umar. So all of these projects came as a development, but it really seemed like these came down from the sky and became like an enclave, an isolated, closed space within the city, and it seems that the services are all for the purpose of international investment or internal investment. We know like Rawabi Center, Rawabi project or neighborhood and Islam Center. We know that we have international corporations and banks in there, or international brands, companies. So even the architectural styles of these seem to be very similar between all of these projects that I mentioned. So this is the main orientation. Another thing that which I would like to note is that there is a transformation in the planning for cities from being cities in the hands of the state to becoming cities and neighborhoods under certain companies and investors. And we know that in the case of Palestine, it is the PIF, Palestine Investment Fund. And this is a fund that comes from investors and the PLO. And they do great investments. If we look at the substantial investment changes occurring in the Arab capitals as well, they are being implemented by investment bodies that have a public-private partnership in which the government is one of the parties that are controlling it, but not the only one. And so the government has a contradictory role. Instead of providing welfare services, such as health service, residences, popular residences, or other things. So, the government is in charge or must be held responsible for the planning of the city. However, these private companies are the ones which are planning hand in hand with the government, and that's because one, the government is making great profits off of that, and two, these projects are done to only certain elite groups inside the society. You do not see, for example, large libraries or governmental universities inside these projects. You see that these are all private ones, consumption-based, in which people consume and buy, and that's it. For example, in Abdali in Jordan, there were some fees for entering Abdali. Whoever wants to enter the project of Abdali needs to pay money. If you want to just go and work, you need to pay money. It's like going to a farmland, gameland, or waterland, water park, or whatever. It's like that. So this is a market. These large corporations or companies are trying to control large things and make substantial investments, such as establishing private hospitals and residences for high-class parties. They're making their investments to parties that are limited. So the building of the society through this have become quite limited and specified towards only one sector. So humanities is not really one of their concerns. Arts and culture and education are not among their interests or concerns, and that's why there are big problems in the way that cities are being developed. How these large institutions are doing investments to just promote international investments in the country instead of promoting the mainstream. Now let me go to the micro level now. Try to remind me to talk about this. When you go to the city, a large amount of visual materials that they see in announcements and advertisements. Advertisements, in my opinion, are a main indicator of the future of the city. So it seems like it's a gateway. Advertisements are like a gateway for the future. So if we look at the advertisements of banks and so on, for example, in Nawabi, we see that there is a restriction of the nature of life in the future. So we are seeing generations or younger categories of people in these advertisements and not people of older age. Just looking for the word for those who are more elderly. So yeah, the older persons in age. So it seems like the announcements and advertisements and billboards specify the younger people, and you see younger guys in suits and ties, and that they're working in offices, and it seems like they should be businessmen and not carpenters or artists or whatever, or they can be artists but in only a touristic way. So this shows us what will happen in Palestine in the future. The future Palestine. Another thing that we see or notice is that these consumption, these places are for consumption, but not for knowledge, and not for those who want to go and criticize the society. It's consumption per se. For example, if we look at the Nawabi, this city is seen as a city which is closed and not open towards environment. I like this announcement or advertisement. It says beautiful view from up on the hill. Beautiful view up on the hill. So this ad does not show a single one of the villages that encircle or neighbor Nawabi. So this is the Nawabi thing. If you look at the image-making aspect of Nawabi, it seems that they have carefully studied this ad before they did it. There is actually a committee that chooses such ads, and if we look at this ad, we see as if Palestine is vacant land, and this even reminds us of the discourse of not only that land without a people and people without a land, but it also reminds us of Mark Twain when he came at the end of the 19th century. He said that Palestine is vacant land and no one lives there, and it is a land which is desolate. And so I do not want to prolong, but this also reminds us of the erasing of cities and also the transfer of its citizens. So look at these ads. This is a photo from the Gilo settlement. Look at some where some Russian artists who came. They wanted to take a photo of it to paint it. There are some Bet Shala villages there. So these Russian artists drew the scene without including the Palestinian villages. It's as if they're trying to erase the Palestinian presence, and they were making the land seem vacant, whereas it is not, because there are villages surrounding Gilo from all over. So the parties which are trying to produce these cities, so to speak, do not participate hand in hand with the local community, and therefore this party is doing things such as Solidaire and Abdali and the Ersal Center, Jordan and Palestine and so on. And it seems as if Palestine has become a vacant land which does not have any history, and it needs to be rebuilt all over and to erase everything which is from the past. And it seems like this is an Orientalist point of thought. Sounds like Orientalists who come and say that Palestine is a land without any people and people without a land. Thank you very much, Mr. Yassir. It seems like a main place where we see that version in architecture is Jerusalem, even though we talked about the Nawawi. But it could be that in each city there is a certain specificity which affects the nature of planning inside that city. Maybe we can discuss that in the Q&A. Now we move to the second speaker, Dr. Lars Grasmi who is a fellow professor from the South Denmark University. He works in the political philosophy and the philosophy of human rights. He will talk today about democracy as fake news. Is democracy today threatened by the media and social media? Please go ahead.
اللي بتأثر على طبيعة التخطيط اللي بيصير في هاي المدينة. ممكن نحكي عن هذا في النقاش وننتقل للمتحدث الثاني دكتور لارس كراسمي بايندر أب. هو أستاذ مشارك ونائب العميد لشؤون التعليم في كلية الإنسانيات في جامعة جنوب دنمارك. يعمل حاليا على قضايا الفلسفة السياسية وفلسفة حقوق الإنسان. المداخلة اللي راح يقدمها هي بعنوان الديمقراطية والتضليل المعلوماتي، هل تشكل وسائل الإعلام والإعلام الاجتماعي تهديدا للديمقراطية اليوم؟ فليتفضل. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me? I think the slide is coming in a minute. It's over there, I think. Well, first of all, I would like to thank very much for being invited here. It's been a great experience for me, very interesting. But I will actually hurry on to my talk because time is of the essence. So next slide, please. Do I have the connection? Yes, okay. I'm going to continue on the theme that we heard about yesterday, a very depressing theme about the deformations of democracy. I'm afraid I'm going to add another negative or depressing theme about the deformation of democracy relating to what we might call the epistemic or knowledge-related underpinnings of democracy deriving from new developments in the media, especially social media. So my point here today is actually something that goes against the initial optimism about the effects of the new information technologies. Many hoped that the advent of new social media would empower the downtrodden and the oppressed in our societies. Think of the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Anonymous, WikiLeaks. There was sort of a great optimism. People talked about the democratization of knowledge and the increased epistemic authority of the citizen. Okay, what I'm going to suggest today is that there's a flip side to that coin. Okay, maybe it's not true what the American philosopher Richard Rorty once said, his slogan, if we take care of freedom, then truth will take care of itself. I'm going to suggest that we have some problems on this front. Next slide. Here's my argument in brief. I'm going to have to speak very fast, I'm afraid. My first point is that the information level of the average citizen today is in fact deteriorating despite all the new technologies. Okay, I'm speaking too fast. It's very difficult. Okay, this is the most difficult thing for me. The first point is that the information level of the average citizen is actually deteriorating. The second point I will make today is that any legitimate and viable democracy presupposes a well-informed citizenry. The third point, and this is my sort of hypothesis, is that to save legitimate democracy, we need to introduce new measures to secure a better level of information, what sometimes is called forms of epistemic paternalism. But I will also look at some of the dangers of this, of such measures. Next slide. Okay, I'm trying to do so. So why am I saying, why is this phenomenon, why am I saying that there's this phenomenon of the deterioration of information? Well, I think there are two main things to point to. First of all, there's a long-term trend of commercialization of the news media that has increasingly led to the commodification of information. It's simply a fact that truth does not sell as well as dumbed down simplifications or dramatic and sensational half-truths and lies. That's one phenomenon. And the other one is the more recent rise in social media. More and more citizens get their news not from the mainstream media, but from social media, and by doing that, they bypass the filter of journalistic standards of balance and objectivity. Is translation going okay? Here are just two facts that try to illustrate this. A majority of American adults, 62%, get news on social media. 18% do so often. 80% of under 30s do not read newspapers daily. 70% of older Americans do. So, next slide, please. One of the effects of this, of course, is a massive amount of disinformation. I'll take here the example of climate change denial. We all know that the International Panel on Climate Change, backed by something like 98% of scientists, say the following: the science now shows with 95% certainty that human activity is the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century. Yet this fact, well-established fact, is believed by less than half of the American population. This is shown here. It's only, I think, 48% that believes that global warming is due to human activity. And another thing that can be shown is that this belief is massively influenced by what political party you belong to. The Republicans, it's only 15% who believe in global warming. The Democrats is 79%. So, next slide, please. Why does this happen? Why does this misinformation happen? Well, I talked about the polarization of media. Fox gives a completely different view of the world as CNN does. There's a trend towards what's called opinionated news. That's one phenomenon. Another one is what happens on the internet. We all have, many of us have heard about this phenomenon of echo chambers. People talk to their friends on Facebook, and they only hear people with the opinions that they share themselves. They hear an echo of themselves when they're accessing the internet. Sometimes it's even the way the internet works itself. It's the way Google works. Google gives you basically what you want to hear. If you usually want to hear about global warming, you'll get news about global warming. If you want to hear about business, you get news about business. So filter bubbles, as they're called, also leads to this massive level of disinformation. The third phenomenon I will point to is what is sometimes called balance as bias. Journalists tend to want to give both sides of the issue. So if they want to talk about climate change, they ask a representative of the 98% of scientists and give him half of the time, and then they'll ask a representative of the 2% of not very good scientists who deny climate change. And by giving balance, they are actually creating bias. Next slide. On top of this, psychological research and research in social epistemology show that humans generally have many epistemic flaws. Humans are simply not very good at processing information. We trust anecdotal evidence. We generalize from too small samples. We stereotype. We engage in wishful thinking. We have confirmation bias, meaning that we always seek the information that confirms what we already believe. And we have this phenomenon of framing effects. If you ask people if they want to buy a drug with a 20% chance of a cure, then a certain amount will buy the drug. If you ask them to buy the drug with the information that it has an 80% chance of failure, a much smaller amount of people will buy it. We are simply not very good as humans in processing information. So next slide. Next slide, please. So here I end my preliminary stage setting. So the quality of information is deteriorating. Voters are getting, that's the one point, and on the other point, voters are generally very bad at processing this information. And here's a quote from one of those philosophers who have for a long time discussed this phenomenon. When the conditions of public discussion with respect to important and central issues allow for or even foster widespread states of irremediable ignorance, asserting the value of free exchange of ideas is no more than the expression of a shallow habitual piety. So it seems the very idea of a free market of ideas is being challenged. Okay. Next one. Now I'm going to, I think I have to go a bit fast and skip some points here. Of course, we have to understand, I now skip to talking about democracy. Democracy is about preference. A democratic procedure, to use the words of Brian Barry, is a method of determining the contents of laws such that the preferences of the citizen have some formal connection with the outcome, in which each counts as equally, as equals. Okay, so democracy is essentially about preference, thus showing how preferences of the individuals become the general will of the people. Next one. But then the question becomes, what preferences? You can either say it's the what you might call the raw preferences, meaning whatever preferences the citizens happen to have, no matter how ill-informed they are. Or it could be the informed preferences, the preferences that the citizens would have had they been informed of the relevant facts. Of course, my point here today will be that what is relevant for a true democracy is, of course, the informed preferences of the population. There are some who have challenged this. By the way, Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, is famous for thinking that people are the best judges of their own needs. And that is a truth when it comes to their basic needs. We know when we suffer, but not much more. Okay, so actually one of the fathers or forefathers of neoliberalism is also playing a role in this wrong conception of democracy. One more, please. So my point is that sometimes we have, because we are misinformed, we have irrational wants. I may be mistaken about what it takes to satisfy my wants due to the fact that I have false instrumental beliefs. So I might think that drinking some water is good for me, because I believe that it will quench my thirst safely, but actually it will kill me because it's poisonous and I don't know. In a sense, I have an irrational want. Also, sometimes my basic wants are actually irrational. I may be brainwashed into believing that I want something where I really don't. For instance, commercials can brainwash women into believing they have to be insanely thin. So there are two ways in which, and this of course is something that is explored in philosophy, the talk about adaptive preferences, or in the Marxist tradition, false consciousness. That also plays a role, of course, in this. The next slide, please. So, at this point, people have, many philosophers, in fact, Brian Leiter is one recent who have done it, has pointed to some sort of paradox. On the one hand, we do not allow unlimited free speech in the courtroom or in the classroom. The teacher decides what information is mostly relevant. In the courtroom, the judge decides what can be admitted as evidence. On the other hand, when it comes to the really important area, how we govern our society, we allow total freedom. Here's a quote. It's too long. There's no free speech in the courtroom. By contrast, when the same people, the lay people, are asked to choose a president, someone who will decide the tax policy, whether to go to war, the correct approach to climate change. The basic idea in the US is that everyone should be able to say almost anything without any meaningful restrictions on the advantages that come to those with wealth and those with access to the major media of communication. I think this is exactly the point here put by Brian Leiter. Next slide. So here's the conclusion. Clearly, the aggregated preference of the citizens, the general will of the citizens, must be constructed from informed preferences of the citizens. So I'm going to suggest, although I have not at all argued this in any detail here, that just as democracy for its legitimacy requires respect for what you might call democracy-related rights, freedom of the press, expression, association, assembly, for instance. We heard Manfred yesterday talk about how this thing comes in a package. Just like we have these democracy-related rights, democracy also, to be legitimate, requires that certain epistemic, knowledge-related standards are upheld. The quality of information has to be, well, reasonably high. Next slide. My final slides. I have no idea how much time I've spent. I'm going to briefly run through what strategies there are to change this. How can we ensure that citizens are better informed, to get out of the pessimism? Next slide. The first is the one I'm going to dismiss. I've been arguing that we should dismiss. Just trust the free market of ideas, and think that maybe an invisible hand like Adam Smith will in the long run deal with the fake news. I think what we've seen is that, as I said, the flip side of the coin, what we get in the modern media is also a much more effective spread of false information. We have Brexit, we have Trump, and we have climate denial, climate change denial, as the three proofs of that point. So next strategy. A classical strategy, of course, is to mention education. And obviously that is part of the solution. Maybe we can make citizens more resistant to bad news by educating them. This could be general education, by the way, funded by the state. Talking about yesterday's neoliberal problematic tendencies, we can further the critical skills of the pupils and respect for science. And we can also have special, and of course many countries have this, special education in critical use of the media. But one of the points I made earlier, the fact that we are all prone to make mistakes when we process information, actually shows that this is actually not enough always. I think a special problem is the education of journalists. Journalists should be better at processing information and portraying scientific information accurately. I mentioned this problem with balance as bias. Next slide. Another strategy, the third strategy, is somehow to have the state intervening. The state should intervene in the free market of ideas in the same way as the state ought to intervene in the real literal market, or literal market. Yes. So one thing you can do is to subsidize state media. That's what we have in Denmark, state media with public service obligation. A second thing you could do is subsidize private media who take on a public service obligation. And you can do that in a way, for you can subsidize both left-wing media, right-wing media, religious media, non-religious media. You can do it in a balanced way. However, again, this is not the whole solution, because as we saw, young people today do not access the public service media. Another intervention for the state could be fact-checking, flagging, showing when news is bad. I'm going to return to that in a minute. You might call that a mild version of epistemic paternalism. Yes? Yes. A suggestion that has been aired is that private media could take care of the situation themselves. So Facebook has famously introduced a fact-checking system that flags fake news. I think this is not well, it's a step on the way, but it's not the ultimate solution. Profit will be the ultimate goal of a private organization, and commercial interest and truth often, and concerns for truth often conflict. Also, flagging is very inefficient. The fake news has already gone viral before it's tagged. The damage has already happened. And finally, it may even be counterproductive. When Facebook flagged fake news, these sites with fake news got many more hits because people thought, it's interesting, what are they trying to hide from us? Okay. So, next slide. That might be, so the final solution is to go one step further. Maybe some sort of new legal measures against or checks on media, so outlawing misinformation in extreme cases, having epistemic or knowledge police, maybe that's the way forward. The advantage here is, of course, that a legal sanction can be imposed after misinformation has gone viral, and therefore can function as a deterrent. Flagging is too late. And also we could point to the fact that there are many existing laws that limit free speech based on epistemic grounds to protect certain moral goals. We have laws against Holocaust denial, some places in Europe, Israel. We have laws against political campaign ads on TV and the publication of polls on election day. That's also a way of controlling information. And also we have bans on commercials with cigarettes and alcohol and extremely thin models. We are already doing this, controlling information on important issues. Recently, a Norwegian philosopher has suggested that we simply outlaw climate denial. It's too important an issue to ignore or to allow misinformation about. Next slide. What are the problems? And these are my last slides, 3 slides. First of all, we have the problem, who decides who gets to be the epistemic censors? It's fairly easy when it comes to matters of science. We have the IPCC and places like that. When it's less easy when it comes to current events. So that's a problem. Of course, there's a classical objection. Powers to censor can be abused by those in power. So we can enter into, or we can get onto a slippery slope towards authoritarianism. I don't think that these slippery slope arguments are that convincing, actually. It is rarely made clear what is the exact mechanism behind the proposed inevitable slide. And also, you might point out that we are already on a slope, because we have already, as I just gave examples of before, we have already restricted access to information on important issues. Next slide. But the third one is my biggest worry. This is my second last slide. My biggest worry is the threat to the perceived legitimacy of democracy. If censorship is introduced, well, it will breed a kind of mistrust and automatic resistance in the population. They will think something like this: if they're trying to withhold this information from us, to hide this information from us, it must be because there are truths that they want to hide from us. Remember the example of Facebook flagging. When news was flagged, people of a certain sort quickly accessed this information because they thought something was being hidden from them. In fact, I think much of the anti-immigration sentiment in Europe is fueled by the perception that those in power do not want the truth to come out, the truth about immigration or failed integration and so on. It's exactly, so I'm very afraid that measures like this, censorship like this, will have the exact opposite effect. It will increase support for the right-wing parties, for instance, in Europe. My final slide. So I'm saying legitimate democracy presupposes that certain epistemic standards are upheld, and even maybe some forms of epistemic paternalism should be introduced, and those were the strategies 2 to 5 I mentioned. Maybe I can even say the following, that the protection of knowledge in the public square should be regarded as a legitimate aim for limiting free speech due to its necessity for democracy. Also echoing some of the things Manfred said yesterday. And the final thing I'll say is, what does this has to do with the Palestinian situation? I think it has a lot to do, but I haven't got the time to connect the dots. But I want to say one thing: when democracy malfunctions, it is the marginalized and the powerless that suffer. Okay, democracy is about giving everyone a vote. When democracy fails, somebody is not getting a say. So if the climate change deniers win out, it is the third world that will suffer. Bangladesh will be underwater, Africa will be turned into a desert. The West, the rich West, will adjust. Okay. Again, if misinformation about the situation of the Palestinians is allowed to flourish or be spread in the European and American context, again, it is the Palestinian cause that will suffer. That's where we're in.
Thank you, Dr. Lars, for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure we're going to have a good discussion, especially about the different strategies that you are proposing and the relation between these strategies and the Palestinian situation. Thank you again. بالأمس في إحدى الجلسات في أمس تم التطرق لمفهوم الكليبتوكراسي. في المداخلة التالية راح يكون في عنا شرح لمفهوم الكليبتوكراسي وإمكانية استخدام هذا المفهوم لتحليل الوضع الفلسطيني القائم. معنا الدكتور حسن أيوب.
Yesterday in one of the sessions, kleptocracy. In the second session, we will explain the concept of the notion of kleptocracy to analyze the political predicament. We have Dr. Hassan Ayoub, who is the head of Department of Political Science at Najah National, specialized in international relations and comparative politics. He has his PhD from Denver University in the U.S., researching on Palestinian issues, governance, and political system, and international affairs, which is neoliberalism, the impact of neoliberal social engineering and political reality in Palestine. The floor is his. Thank you very much for your introduction. Firstly, I have changed the title of this paper. We academics are usually do tentative kind of work, but then do some modification. In our Palestinian predicament, the features of kleptocracy and the building of Palestinian society in the neoliberalist context is actually the new title. Just like Mr. George Jackman was saying yesterday, and we were asking several questions, especially a question related to the strategic balance of the Palestinian society. This paper comes as a trial to tackle the question of Mr. George Jackman, even though I hadn't planned this in the beginning. Of course, we have some collective values, but these values have been changing in Palestine. What happened to the strategic balance that Mr. George was talking about? What happened to that? It seems like it has changed. So we will tackle this within the Palestinian predicament, and we will look at the neoliberalistic political context. But the neoliberalism does not see the society in the same way, and we would like to talk about the changes that happened in Palestine from the context of kleptocracy as a basis for the changes and transformations that took place in Palestine since 2007, in which the international interventions became quite intense. First, we want to talk about the state to the civil society and the agents of change and the market aspects and also the political culture. My paper starts with trying to tackle democracy as an international value and democracy in a neoliberal context. Mr. Hussein says that in the 21st century, the issue of democracy no longer became seen as whether democracy is suitable to a society, but societies were seen, were actually questioned whether they go hand in hand with democracy, and not the other way around. The answer is that until today, democracy is the best form of governance. But democracy as an international value does not mean that there is absolute consensus on it, but there is a majority of people who support democracy because it supports the poor and the marginalized people. And that's because there is a single understanding of democracy that many times people see democracy as something related to the New World Order, unfortunately, and so some people view it as such, and in which people from the higher level comes and intervene. decades growth to society in Palestine, which shows a new international willingness to transform societies that mix between international aid and political intervention. So, a crisis of democracy or the neoliberal era was the name of this session, and I see that in this issue we have a problem in the neoliberal era. Democracy has become an international value, and so we must see how democracy is different from country to another or region from another. For example, the democracy in Europe is different than that in the United States. There are different forms of democracy. There's something called power sharing, and also there is the democracy under the Marxist or Leninist backgrounds. So there isn't a one size fits all, as said by the speaker yesterday. But democracy is based on various aspects. Hence, democracy is not necessarily related to liberalism or neoliberalism or post-liberalism, but but democracy tackles political and economic freedom. Hence, there are various freedoms inside the market, which must go hand in hand with the political freedoms. Therefore, democracy in its liberal context is one of the main cornerstones and components of capitalism, and democracy calls for equality and so on. But in the actual, on the ground, we see many times the contrary. Hence, in the actual ground, we see that a small number of persons are controlling the economy, the policies, and what have you. And in a system or a regime in which the majority don't intervene, there would be a problem in the market. We see that just like John Stewart said, that he talked about the political and socio-economic aspects, and they must always be interrelated, and they must not contradict. So there must be coordination between the societies and the persons. So is Palestine able to do this role under the Palestinian Authority and the heavy international interventions in Palestine? Here we try to tackle the form and context of Palestine under kleptocracy. We see that there are individual interests that many times take over, and so this causes qualitative effects. So this leads to a certain socio-economic system based on kleptocracy, and democracy and neoliberalism have led to kleptocracy in Palestine. I am now reading the Webster definition of kleptocracy, but Cambridge Encyclopedia has a different definition, which the speaker is reading now. So, as for the Free Dictionary, it has a different definition. Quickly reading those definitions. These three definitions are very, very suitable, and they are valid for the third world. But in the neoliberalist world, things have changed used and the systems and so on of kleptocracy, we see that systems that there are systems that violate the human rights, control wealth and capital, capitalize over society and the market. And so in the Palestinian predicament, we try to internationalize the thing and to receive major profits for the purpose of individual interests on the account of the public interests. Hence, the kleptocratic system does not have the educational system, but they might pay millions of dollars to build a castle for president or a palace for the president. So these kleptocratic systems have become a capitalistic system of governments that rob their people and take their lands and cause corruption and seize havoc. Hence, we see that, for example, in the United States, we see even phenomena of kleptocracy, even though there is a very strong constitution there. So we can also understand kleptocracy, as Montesquieu said, that what threatens a society is corruption, and corruption leads to oppression. Corruption is one of the main traits of kleptocratic societies. Whenever corruption prevails and spreads, it shows that there will be much deeper problems, such as the failure of the judicial system and the inability of other societies to do their duties accordingly, and lack of organization, and the narrowing down of policies and politics, and there are other problems. So this leads to oppression, and it excludes policies or politics from the mainstream, and this shows that it is very important to listen to the political views of persons, so that this oppression would not take over, and especially when we look at the importance of the socio-economic level. Hence, under kleptocracy, people do not see a meeting point between individual and national interests. Therefore, we must try to understand the relation of the state. We are not really a state in its real meaning, but the Palestinian Authority works many times as if it is a state or political interest, political entity. But what kleptocracy led to is that neoliberalist capitalism led to a change in the market, and the forces of the market started taking over on account of the state. However, the state became the number one tool for helping the capital to move forward and creativity and so on, so that they would serve the capitalistic neoliberal interests. Hence, the restructuring and reinvesting of internationals need stability that only a state can provide. Therefore, if we assume under neoliberal economy is the main strategy to face poverty. However, it has its own rules and principles. It must act in the best way and in a way that takes in hand good governance into perspective, and political practices must be the best way. This led to radicalism, nationalism, and in the third world it led to failed states. In the Palestinian situation, we actually do not really have a state, but we can look at the political and economic behavior of the state. The government is losing its power to the market forces. And so the neoliberalistic economy is taking strong roots over the PA, and this gave the chance for Israel and the international community a shock. As Noam Klein said, a shock doctrine in his book. So these options could not be put without a shock. And so there was the threatening of stopping to help the PA if they do not go hand in hand with their specifications and requirements. So after post-liberalism, we saw that there was a kind of manipulation, and Salim Fayyad had the Palestinians become an observer state, and of course this neoliberalistic system led to changes in Palestine. The political elites started intervening on various levels. Second, the daily economic crisis of society started moving towards consumption. This was the new system, and this system led to a change in the values of the Palestinian society. So this curbed or reduced the national values of volunteering and social support and so on. So now we have a model which far surpasses neo-patrimonialism. It even became a kleptocratic state that can be a dependent state. So another thing is that we must look at the social engineering aspects and its impact on political reality. Palestinian society was a bottom-up rural society, just like Alex de Tocqueville said. They talked about the rural society. This applies to Palestine, and in Palestine, this civil society became NGOs, and NGOs are directly linked to international agendas and capitalism. And therefore these NGOs, which are more than 3,000 according to some statistics, led to three main results. About 40 to 50,000 people work for these NGOs, and $1.6 billion are transferred to them annually, and they have changed the social and political agendas, and they have become a huge attraction point and influence. Also, they became an alternative model for the lifestyle, and they have changed the society, and they have attracted people to go to move to these societies to make more money and have more position. And also there have been changes on the market and capitalism. Also another thing has to do with creative people inside the society. Of course, we all remember the hunger strike of the inmates. During that, if if the Palestinian political factions did mobilization, they maximum had 50 people participating, but Jawal and other corporations could bring hundreds of employees immediately. It seems like these have become the political forces, the corporations. So therefore the political and democratic forces are the agents of change, are supposed to be as such, but they have had a great shortcoming. The PA also can bring many of their employees to have great influence. NGOs also and the private sector have their employees and their elements. But amidst all of that, how can the political forces exert their influence? Dr. George, we must understand that the government has very limited power inside the society. Another point is the dichotomies inside the market, inside the Palestinian society. There are two systems for social relations. This is related to the social positions and the proximity of people to the kleptocratic regimes. For example, in terms of schools, if you have money, you can send your children to private schools, and if you do not, most likely you send your children to public schools. And we have seen how public schools have been deteriorated. Same thing applies to the health sector, the public health sector versus private sector. In banks too, there's the VIP and premium. They go directly in the queue, while the others must wait in the queue. And as an architectural level, just like Mr. Anan, Yazid Anani was saying, there is a Wabi model, for example, and even in Nablus, there is a huge, major change in Nablus. We're calling it the Ramallahization of Nablus. Huge changes. So now we are seeing a social rebuilding inside of Palestine, and we're using terms such as social responsibility. But if you really look deep into it, it seems like it supports the neoliberal agenda, and it puts everything in the hands of corporations. There is even a great deformation of the social responsibility or abuse of, and therefore, even when you look at the advertisements, when you're driving, you see KFC is Palestinian 100%. You see ads like that. And even now Jawal sends ads that says, I am free, therefore I can buy Jawal packages as much as I want. It seems that they are abusing or mistreating the thing of nationalism. Even Coca-Cola are using this national feeling of or sentiments of Palestine. You are free, therefore you can buy Jawal packages. It's like they're abusing, because the Palestinian sense of freedom is not related to cooperation. So did kleptocracy transform Palestine into people who accept to be slaves of the market? And as the French philosopher Ipan said, he said, slavery by choice, in one of his main articles, Article 15, if I'm not mistaken, in which he talks about the stable citizen. And now in Palestine, citizens care for three things: religious duties, watching soccer, and getting his livelihood. That's it. Thank you, Dr. for this great analysis for the economic, political, and social situation of the Palestinian citizen. And thank you for abiding by the time. Now we start with the Q&A. We can take a number of questions. Yes, we can start from there. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the organizers, the university, the academics and non-academics. We feel like this is a society which is passing through a kind of humidity inside the society. This is how I call it in the social, political, and economic situation now, because the great flaws inside the society led to that. Now, what raised my attention was the paper of Dr. Yazid Anani. Dr. Yazid was talking about engineering and social aspects, and these are directly related to the economic aspects. This is because today we see that the artistic views have been distorted. If you look at Nablus, for example, my city, when you look at that city, there's no real beauty in terms of art and so on. Same thing in Ramallah. When I go there, or when I come here, I feel weird. The aesthetics aspect is missing. This is why we have lost our values pertaining to aesthetics. When we do that, this has our willingness disappear, and the lack of willingness is also related to the political values that are imposed on us from the political situation. As a parliamentarian, I would like, when I came to face corruption or curb the corruption, and especially in relation to the green area that the municipality intervened in, this led to Rawabi establishment and also Nablus changes and so on. This was a political decision, but I see that it is also an economic and social decision. This limited our expansion inside the cities and villages, and this allowed the settlements to expand further, and they closed down certain areas. This increased our bondage, our slavery to the society, to the political forces, and we must never be quiet, but we must always speak out. The second speaker regarding
قانون سياسي، ولكن أنا بعتبره قانون اجتماعي وقانون سياسي وقانون اقتصادي، حد من كل التوسع اللي ممكن كان يحصل لمدننا ولقرانا، وخلى المساحات الخضراء هي مساحات لتمدد المستوطنين. أخلص بس بدي أحكي إنه دائما متلازمة العبودية اللي بفرضها علينا النظام السياسي لازم ما تخلينا نسكت وبس نشخص، لازم نعلي الصوت. شكرا.
Micro.
The second speaker regarding social media's impact on the public opinion regard, for instance, to the global warming. Why is it affecting it negatively and not positively? I mean, I lived in the US for many years, and I know that there are many people who believe, as you said, about 79% of the Democrats believe in global warming. So why can't they affect it positively rather than negatively? Why is it the impact comes always from are they more vocal, those who are negative, or what are they? Social media is open for everybody. So I'm not really convinced that this is a major factor. I mean, people like Trump affect this view much more than social media. I think he's just his style, his followers, etc. So if you can explain that more, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
شكرا. Question to Dr. Yazid. You said 9/11. What happened in 9/11? In which year? And what happened then? Which year? And what's that related to the hierarchy or structures of cities? And if you meant 9/11 of 2001, what's that related really to the engineering aspects?
سؤال للدكتور حسن.
Question to Dr. Hassan.
سكر الدنيا في وجهه.
He closed everything in our face.
قوى الحشد وقوى التغيير.
The forces of change, the forces of mobilization.
القطاع الخاص.
He limited that to the stable private sector and the large corporations and the employees of NGOs and the governmental sector and yes, civil society organizations. It seems to me that the society is much wider than these centers, whereas the workers or employees of the private sector work in unlimited contracts, but their number is less than 16% of 360,000. Hence, the people who work in the private sector are very few in comparison. 1/3 of the labor force are unemployed, in addition to the farmers who do not have any relation to the interests of corporations and the PA government authority. That you would, despite all of this, we hope that you would elaborate that. Despite all of that, we see that there have been some moves towards putting minimum labor rates and also increasing the rates. The experience of the teachers' strikes were a good example on improving the people's situation and also the welfare aspects. There have been some problems inside the government in terms of people being discontent, such as in the health sector. And there was also a weakened role of governmental agencies in improving the situation. Please go ahead with the question. Yes. The neoliberal developments also press things downwards, meaning that we are about to have a higher level of poverty inside the society. The question is as such. I would like to call Mr. Hassan to open up a scope in relation to this reality. Open scope, like try to illustrate, try to expand on. Yes, just a quick point. Thanks a lot, Dr. Hassan. And that's because the picture that he explained is really our reality. We have been hijacked by this system. It has been a great trap. But the question is, how can we leave this trap? How can we get out of this trap? Just thank you, everyone, for your interventions. Question to Dr. Yazid in relation to cities. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I am trying to understand. The question is, how can we understand the Palestinian situation from the perspective of your comments? From my understanding of urban planning, which is quite limited, I see that from the urban and historical point of view, civilizations are influenced by each other in terms of building patterns, whether during the Greek, Roman, Islamic eras, there was always some influence. By being influenced by the architectural modernity and technology of a more powerful force, whether in the East or West. It is clear that the neoliberal pattern is a bit more aggressive on a global level. Question to you, from the engineering point of view, what is new in this new neocolonialism? What is the new thing in this engineering that is extracted from neoliberalism? Another thing, your explanation of Rawabi and in terms of seeing it as a resurgence or reintroduction of the land without a people, Zionist thing. I do not know if this would be very precise, but how does the new architecture correspond or interact with the older one? Interaction. That's because architecture is interaction. It's not just that elites come and put something on the ground. There are things that are accepted by people, things that are not accepted. Also, there are the different colors of Rawabi. People made it, the engineers of Rawabi made it in yellow color in order to indicate that the old Palestinian buildings were made in Palestine. Question to Dr. Lars now.
The quality of information. Dr. Lars, about the quality of information and democracy, and it sounds like it's a very appealing idea of, how can we make citizens more informed for democracy to flourish. That's what I understood from your presentation. But I just didn't understand what you meant by the state censorship over information, because my understanding is all what democracy tried to do is to have the open source of information and all of that. And I see where you're coming from. But I think it feels like your argument, if you excuse my expression, it comes without contextualization, because if we think about the Middle East and the state in the Middle East, the last thing we want to do is to give any kind of censorship for the state. So I think the question is for what kind of state? And I think it's in the suggestion you gave about how we can solve this information of the misinformed citizen. I think we need to problematize the idea of the informed citizen. Like, what do you mean by the informed citizen? The liberal citizen, because we understood from the presentation before by Professor Andrea, he goes against the state. That's my understanding. He wants a democracy that comes from below, that it's a different, that the public sphere will generate different kind of democracy. And you stress the idea of education, but it's like, paying a lip service to the idea of education, even though I would imagine that if we would talk about informed citizen, it should come from education, but basically you stress state as the major tool for this democracy, and I think that's a huge contradiction of our understanding of democracy.
Thank you.
Yeah, my comment is also to Lars. I do agree very much with your analysis, but I'm also skeptical about the type of solutions. Some of them I do agree with education, and of course also more subsidies, both to the public corporations and also private media. But if you start with epistemic censorship, saying that we should actually outlaw climate change denial, etc., I'm already skeptical about the efficiency of Holocaust denial laws and similar things. But I mean, if we start with that, I think the misuse by authoritarian governments, I mean, I could imagine what all would be outlawed in China and in Russia and in many other states if we in liberal democracies start to outlaw certain kind of truths or truisms. Thank you.
I couldn't disagree more with your analysis, and I was quite frankly flabbergasted. One of my concerns with, the foremost concerns with what it entails to enter into a neoliberal era is not only that the world around us is changing, but that we lose the means to critique that world. We literally lose a language. The only language that is available for us to critique neoliberal or liberal schemas for our world is precisely the language of neoliberalism. And I think your lecture was an extraordinarily stark illustration of that. What's so striking to me are the sort of internal contradictions in the argument. You say on the one hand that democracy presupposes a well-informed, reasoned citizens and so forth, and then the same research shows that we are epistemically flawed. So isn't the presumption false? Isn't your whole fantasy of liberal democracy in fact a fantasy? And I have to ask, so why do we need recent, behavioral research to show us this? Ludwig Wittgenstein, a whole philosophical tradition, which is the philosophical tradition of the Enlightenment, although a minor tradition. David Hume, Edmund Burke, Ludwig Wittgenstein. We do not agree on opinions. We agree in forms of life. Right? We don't need a behavioral scientist or some half-baked economist to tell us these things. And I think it's extraordinarily striking to hear a complaint about the degeneration of, let's say, news coverage in the contemporary moment, positing fake news as, vis-a-vis some sort of abstract, good quality of journalism. To do that in Palestine, I mean, to be Palestinian is to be the victim of fake news for your entire existence. What is Western discourse on this country? It's fake news. The Nakba didn't really happen. They didn't really intend to expel the Palestinians. And it's quite ironic that you posit that the problem is the commercialization of the media, that we get bias because of commercialization. Because if you look, I was a journalist for a very long time, and if you look at the history of journalism, particularly this history of a sort of notion of objectivity in journalism, it arises why? Because you have a moment in which people, political parties and so forth, are distributing, early sort of Renaissance period, distributing leaflets in the streets, which are very opinionated, they're making arguments. And then comes capitalism, and with capitalism comes the opportunity to sell advertisements. And that is where the notion of objectivity arises, because people figure out that if you write non-offensive, right, content that a large number of people will not disagree with, then you can sell more advertising. So objectivity is, in fact, a function, in a certain sense, of capitalist liberal ideology.
Thank you. آخر سؤال.
But I would like to add one thing from the Palestinian point of view to emphasize that the main question is that I was confirming what Peter was saying, and I would like to add to what Dr. Ghada said. It's not the country or the state that specifies what is the correct info. The thing is, who specifies quality or correct information? For example, in your country, Denmark, it is one of the model countries for democracy. You have a law that forbids the denial of Holocaust. Do you have any law that forbids the denial of the Palestinian Nakba or the Israeli colonization? Does your country punish those who do that? Who specifies what is the truth? And also in the Facebook model, we see how they try to curb the truth many times. In the Middle Ages in Europe, when there was the Protestant Reformation, it seemed as if there was a change, a call for change inside the church. But now we see that now there is a call to remove the official information and have people participate in the society. What is the problem in people participating in the truth or introducing the truth? Last question in brief. Thank you. Why do we keep always praise the government when many times the basis of the state is against the people? Edward Said and Shenzo and other people many times talked about this. For example, many of the Western governments are against their people themselves. There is a book that I highly recommend, Letter of Violence. That's the name of the book. This book talks about the sequence or relation between democracy and violence. Why, for example, why did the Greeks create democracy? It was in order to distinguish between the slaves and the free. That the slaves cannot vote, but the free could vote. From this came the idea of Western democracy, that many times we see that it is essential and vital. Even if we look at the historical changes that took place in France and America, they did not take place from the governments, but from the people themselves. Power was taken by force from the government itself. Even in the United States, the civil rights movement in the United States, we see how, for example, the right of women to vote did not come from the government of the United States. It came from the people's mobilization, the people calling for their rights, civil rights. I was at the Masarat conference today and we were talking about the same subject. Nabil Shaf and Ismail Hani, we were talking about this the other day. Okay, 1 minute for each speaker to answer. I would like to start with the last comment. My research paper is not about the government, but about the people. So I was talking about the authority from a more wider scope, and based on the various political arrangements or orders. So many times, we see, for example, that there is an offer that can come up from the United States as a deal. And so, in other words, within this context, we see that there is a recess in the Palestinian predicament. I do not mean to be pessimistic, but as an academic, as an activist and previous prisoner, I can see these things from the up close and personal aspect. So during the strike of teachers, the teachers have an association within the PLO. And so the PLO allowed this association of teachers to come and express their discontent. So there was also the labor union meeting and the strikes that took place. So is there a situation of stalemate? Yes, a stalemate does exist. And today you have more than 200,000 Palestinian workers passing the green light, green line to go and work in Israel. So these are all crises for us, and there are agents of change that can come and put the Palestinian society back on track. We are talking about socio-economic forces that are governing the Palestinian people. It is no longer like the Palestinian Intifada, the people from the refugees and the inmates who were leading the society. Today it is the entrepreneurs who are governing the people and not the refugee people or what have you, from the villages. Just as my fellow professor was saying, this fragmentation that is taking place inside the society, but for the first time ever I see myself as a pessimist, and I feel like a stranger here from the political, from the scene itself. I do not have answers, honestly. Many things, I have many questions and do not have answers. I'm sorry, but this is my opinion. Dr. Lars, please. Wow.
شكرا.
Dr. Lars, please.
Wow. Five questions. I'll try to be quick, of course. The first question, a good question. Of course, I'm not trying to explain the fact that Republicans in America distrust the scientists just by social media. I think I put up a whole range of reasons: bad polarization of the media, bad education, failure of education, echo chambers. So I think there are many reasons. I think probably the reason why the Republicans don't believe in climate change is because they watch Fox News. That was one of the reasons. But also I think my point is that social media also has positive effects. It has liberating potentials, but it also has, I called it the flip side of the coin. Then I think the person left a good question, which I think I simply will grant. I'm of course thinking very much in a Western context. I'm thinking that if the Danish state, for instance, outlaws commercials on political commercials, that is not going to cause dictatorship in Denmark. That's a good measure. So I'm not so worried. But of course, I take it that if regimes that are already authoritarian, they can use this as a means of repression. And so my part about the slippery slope was perhaps actually designed for Western context, or a context of a country with an established democracy. Then, and this, well, my argument, I guess I was being provocative. My argument was that there are different strategies. I definitely favor the first three strategies, and they are sort of also they're already in use. They are common strategies already. The provocative suggestion was the fifth, and actually I'm very much in doubt. But you don't have a talk if you don't have something provocative to present. And I had my worries. Actually, I had three objections to it, and I think I actually agree. Probably it cannot be done, but also there's some sort of desperation, because I think the other measures might not do the job. That's my worry, and I have many friends who are epistemologists who are pushing the other point. We have to do something. Then comes Peter's question. I think there, well, we have a fundamental disagreement. I have this crazy idea that there are yes. So you don't think it's okay, for instance, to ban political commercials on TV. The point of banning political commercials on TV is that those who have money don't get to have more say in the political process. Well, okay, let me just give a straight answer to some of the things you said. I believe that there are objective facts. I believe it's an objective fact that we appear to be heading towards a disaster on climate change. I believe that it's an objective fact that land is being robbed, a nation is being robbed from the Palestinians. There are objective facts. These facts must come out. I'm worried that, and I think it really doesn't help any sort of liberation struggle or struggle for justice or freedom or equality. Sorry. It doesn't help any struggle for freedom to relativize facts. Facts are the truth is often what sets those oppressed free, not the other way around. It's that those in power want to twist the truth. Okay. So I guess we have a disagreement there. We maybe take it over dinner. I've lost. I think I've spent my time, but yeah.
Dr. Yazid, I will speak quickly. 11 September, I am sorry for the mistake. I really meant 9/11, sorry. The tax returns that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf were investing all stopped. They stopped investing in Europe after 9/11. And here we're saying 2001. In 2005, all these large mega companies stopped investing in certain areas, and of course American companies started investing in oil wells, and they did deregulation, and they opened the door for international investments in Iraq. If the Palestinian Investment Fund emerged in that period, 2003 and 2004, and 2005, they started working on the projects. Baghdad Group in Cairo and Solidaire in Beirut, same thing with the company in Jordan. It seems like there is a quite mutual date where there is neoliberal changes for changing cities and of course Gulf investments in the Arab region in general. This is what I was talking about now. In relation to your question, of course, from the historical point of view, there is no certain architectural pattern that stays in one region. There is always a spread and exchange of knowledge and technologies. This is very normal. However, what is different in the 18th century is that the planning of cities started being part of the treaties or the systems of the government. Governments started being responsible for the best architectural thing. This was not related only to the aesthetics point of view with the colors, red and so on, whatever, but they became a system of procedures for the countries to impose their power. Foucault talked about this security, territory and population, talked about these transformations during his lectures, Foucault that is, of course, and here when we look at it from in Palestine, in terms of the elements of the Palestinian liberation project. In the 70s and 80s, we saw that there were Palestinian artists in the cities and the villages, who were drawing some graffiti saying the land belongs to us, and we were seeing that the farmer is the basis of the Palestinian cause. The villages were producing things, olives or what have you. All of these things we inherited without knowing why, Palestinian embroidery or what have you. But after 2002, the second Intifada, all of this was redirected somewhere else. It seemed like the olive became a capitalistic thing. There was the Palestinian investment conference. The olive became, for capitalism purposes, it stopped being a sign of our liberation movement. Olives became a capitalistic project. The land became a capitalistic serving thing. So instead of being controlled by the colonization, we put ourselves as servants of capitalism. Thank you very much for the speakers. Now is the time for lunch. We hope you will enjoy your meal. To come back to the fifth session.